And good morning, Mayor and Council. It is Heritage Day. We've been really looking forward to coming to you to discuss all our heritage programs. So we have quite a team here to help you. As noted, we're starting off with the Heritage Briefing to talk about all the work that we do on heritage. This will be followed by a presentation by the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust, and I'll let them introduce themselves at the time that they're presenting, and then we'll be concluding with a report on the Heritage Tax Incentive Program. So the Heritage Briefing will be provided by Laura Saretsky, and I would note that this is her first time presenting with Council. Laura is our Heritage Planner in Community Planning, responsible for heritage policy work, and she also supports development services with heritage application processes. Laura has a master's in Cultural Heritage Management, and prior to joining the city, she was the Heritage Program Manager at Heritage BC. In this role, she worked on capacity building and supporting the heritage sector in British Columbia through grant programs, surveys, advocacy, and developing learning programs. So we are very happy to have her as part of our heritage team to help manage and advance Victoria's heritage programs. Joining Laura at the center table is Andrea Hudson, Assistant Director of Community Planning. We also have with us, just behind the table, Crystal Stevenot. Crystal is our Senior Heritage Planner with Development Services, and you've met her previously, so I won't give another bio for Crystal. And we also have Alison Meyer, our Assistant Director of Development Services. So we're really very much looking forward to the discussion, and there will be many opportunities for questions along the way. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Laura to provide the overview on the city's heritage programs, and we'll move forward from there.
Thanks very much, and thanks and welcome, Ms. Retsky. And I will just, before you get started, I will remind Council that we do have 3 separate briefings this morning, all relating to heritage. And so when we do come to questions, it would be great if we could focus our questions on each briefing and not necessarily deal with them holistically or overlap. Or you, Ms. Retsky, lead us through.
Thank you. As was just mentioned, my name is Laura Saretsky, and I'm with Community Planning. I'm a heritage planner there. And as was alluded to, there will be regular pauses for questions throughout my briefing. It's going to be approximately 30 minutes, 5 topics plus a conclusion. So happy to answer questions as we go. And you know, if you need me to re-explain something, happy to do so. We're dealing with some concepts up front, so happy to answer any questions as we move through in those question periods. And to start us off, I just wanted to give a super brief, super quick overview of the history of Victoria's Heritage Program, because it's been around for quite a long time, to kind of how did we get here where we are right now. And it's been on the cutting edge in the province and Canada. We've been one of the first municipalities to do a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. And I, in fact, still get inquiries from planners and other municipalities throughout Canada asking, how did you do it? Can you talk me through like your incentives, how your program works? Because we're so well known across Canada for the work that we do. And we started doing this work in the 70s with heritage designations and moved on to grants starting in 1978, technically before we were actually able to do it. So then we had to create some arm's length organizations to continue our granting programs, which will be touched on later. And you'll actually hear from one of them later today as well. We started doing windshield surveys and heritage conservation areas, though under a different name at the time, as well as hiring a heritage planner. And in the 80s, when we really beefed up our heritage register, we started doing tax incentives in 1998. Shortly after legislation allowed us to do that, we were starting to do it. And we've actually won the Prince of Wales Award for Heritage Conservation. There's only a handful of municipalities in Canada who have won this award, so it's quite prestigious. There's actually a plaque downstairs in the lobby about this, so we're well recognized, and we've been doing this for quite a long time. So that's kind of the background as we get into some of the concepts now of heritage as it is today. So first off, the very first concept I want to talk a little bit about is conservation. This word comes up a lot when we're talking about heritage, and it's really actually an umbrella term for 3 different types of conservation, which are preservation, rehabilitation, and restoration. Preservation involves protecting, maintaining, and stabilizing the existing form, material, and integrity of a historic place or individual component while protecting its heritage value. It can include short-term and interim measures, as well as long-term protection and stabilization. and it staves off deterioration and prevents damage. Rehabilitation involves a sensitive adaptation of a historic place or individual component for continuing or compatible contemporary use while protecting its heritage value. Rehabilitation can include replacing missing features. The replacement may be a replica or an approximation of a point in time. And then restoration, finally, involves accurately revealing, recovering, or representing the state of a historic place or individual component as it appeared at a particular point in time while protecting its heritage value. Restoration may include removing elements that have been added since that decided point in time, and then also creating new elements to create that appearance. The image here is of the Rivet building on Wharf Street, and this is an example of preservation. What they're doing here is they're just painting in the same colors that are already there, and that's to make sure that the building is maintained over time and that it's kept in good shape. So it's kind of that ongoing preservation maintenance. That's an example of that. And then this is an example of rehabilitation. This is the Vogue building at 1450 Government. The mech is in the ground floor. And it's an example of rehabilitation because it wasn't restored to a specific point in time. Some features were added based on its heritage value, an approximation of things as it would have looked like, as you can see in that drawing in the bottom, is what it originally appeared as. So it's not restoration, but it is rehabilitation, as those heritage values were enhanced and represented when the work was done on it. And then finally, this is an example of restoration. This is a Monaco building just across the street from the Vogue building. And as you can see, they restored the cornice when they did the work on this to convert it into lofts and retail on the bottom floor. It's not a complete restoration. Some elements of this building were actually rehabilitation because it doesn't look exactly as it does in that historic photo on the bottom. It's a combo. And actually most conservation work we do is a combination of one, of two, three of the different types. It's pretty rare to have a project that is just one of them, except for those little maintenance projects that we do over time. The next key term I want to talk about is facadism. I'm sure everyone's probably heard this term. It is generally defined as retaining only the front facade of a building. Sometimes it's used to describe just retaining the walls, and that's it, basically digging out the interior, though the more common definition is just retaining the front. It's a method to retain the public face of a building, but it privileges architectural and aesthetic value over everything else because it's just about what it looks like to the public on that front face. It can absolutely be the right choice for conservation. There's certainly situations where it's the only choice even, but it's not always. It can be quite contentious, and sometimes it's seen as the easy way out for a developer to retain a heritage facade, but then just incorporate it into something totally different. And this is two examples of facadism in the city. On the left is the Bay Center. It incorporated and actually reconstituted some heritage facades from buildings that were there before it was built. None of them look exactly the way they looked before, and it's just kind of part of the center, but you wouldn't even know it from the inside that those facades were there. And on the other side, there's the Union Building, which includes 530 Pandora, which was actually a building that was damaged by fire quite severely before this development happened, and only the facade actually survived. So that's an example of facadism where it was, you couldn't save the rest of the building because it wasn't there anymore. But it's been very sensitively put into this development, and it kind of has pride of place on the street. So you still experience the street as it would have been before that fire. So that's two examples of how facadism happens. But it's quite a nuanced thing, facadism is. And something that's also very nuanced is authenticity. This is a word that comes up with heritage quite a lot, but it's something that's actually very, very hard to define, because who gets to define what's authentic? Who makes that determination? And it's something that to step away from a little bit, because the idea of authenticity and pinning something in time can actually be quite a Western European ideal. Not all cultures share that idea of authenticity. So trying to apply it to all heritage doesn't work, and it's not community forward, and it's not actually good heritage work. So trying to define it is something that maybe we shouldn't be attempting to do, just because who gets to say what is authentic. And this is an example of that kind of squishy, how is authenticity working. This is an image of the Fernwood Inn in Fernwood Village on the right-hand side. The Tudor exterior was applied in the 80s. Before that, it was just a stuccoed building. Obviously, Tudor buildings wouldn't exist in North America. And this is supposed to be like Tudor as opposed to Tudor Revival is the vibe that they're going for here. But actually, this kind of Tudor is the Victorian idea of what Tudor buildings looked like. Actual Tudor buildings wouldn't have black beams. So it's who gets to say what's authentic there, because there's so many different time periods working on this building, and not to mention place. But it doesn't look wrong in the square. It actually looks like it fits with its surroundings, and it fits with the kind of in-pub style of what the building's used for. So is it actually authentic then? So this is kind of who gets to define authenticity in certain cases, and whether or not it's something we should be pursuing at all is what I want to leave you with authenticity. Moving on to something that's a little bit less vague. Adaptive reuse is the rehabilitation of heritage buildings for new use that breathes in new life. A building used is a building saved is something we say a lot in heritage, and adaptive reuse is one of the ways we go about doing that. Sometimes a building can't be used for its original use for various reasons, so that's where a compatible new use comes in, and that's adaptive reuse. This is 2 examples of adaptive reuse in the city. On the left-hand side is the Morley Soda Factory on Waddington Alley. Former factory, not used for that anymore, and it's actually been converted into strata. It's a multi-unit building with a sensitive addition on the top that kind of evokes that industrial past and is quite sensitively done, and the heritage values of that building are retained. And then on the right-hand side, we have the Belfry Theatre, which is originally the Emmanuel Baptist Church in Fernwood Square, but then it became a youth shelter, and today it's a theatre. Again, those uses are compatible with the building, and you can actually really tell that the building was originally a church, even from the inside to outside. And the Belfry has done a lot of work to conserve and bring it back to its original appearance. So that's a use that is compatible, but obviously quite different than what it was originally used for. Statements of significance are something we talk a lot about in heritage. You've probably already seen them, actually. And statements of significance are planning documents. The format is determined by federal policy, which I'll actually talk about a bit later when I go into the policy section, the standards and guidelines. And the province and the national level has requirements for how we write statements of significance, what they have to include, how long they are actually, and they're what gets put on the register at both the provincial and national level. And we require them in the city for putting on the register, our register, and designations. And they're broken into 3 parts. First is a description, that's just a couple lines explaining what the building is and where it is. And then the heritage value section, which lists the aesthetic, historic, scientific, cultural, social, or spiritual importance or significance for past, present, and future generations of the place. The heritage value of a historic place is embodied in its character-defining elements, which are the final section, which is a bullet list of the materials, forms, location, spatial configurations, uses, and cultural associations or meanings that contribute to the heritage value of a historic place and must be retained. So we use that list to help us determine when proposed work on a heritage place is appropriate and what would be a better alternative or how we should go about maybe changing uses, what's compatible, those kinds of things. So it's a really foundational document. It's short, but it's super important. And just as a quick example of how that looks in practice, City Hall is a designated site. It's also a National Historic Site. And for example, it has aesthetic value as an example of Second Empire style institutional building. And that's represented in the character-defining elements, including its clock tower and some of the external elements and detailing on the outside. So that's an example of how we word those and how we use them to do heritage conservation. Cultural landscapes are also something that we include in heritage. And a cultural landscape is defined by UNESCO as the manifestation of the interaction between humankind and its natural environment. This can include traditional agricultural landscapes, gardens, parklands, and religious or spiritual landscapes. And 2 examples in the city of Victoria that are actually designated are the Ross Bay Cemetery on the left and Megan Beacon Hill Park on the right. Both cultural landscapes, different cultural landscapes. One is, of course, a cemetery, and the other is a parkland. But designated cultural landscapes in the city nonetheless. Intangible heritage is also something that is gaining more attention in heritage, and that's also defined by UNESCO as practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. It's then transmitted from generation to generation and is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity. Now, we can't actually designate intangible heritage in the city because the Local Government Act only deals with real property when it comes to heritage, which is to say the physical properties. But we could create a list. It wouldn't be a register because, again, we have the power to create registers through the Local Government Act, which is grounded in real property. But it is something that I've been turning my mind to because it is so important. And intangible heritage is a key part of diversifying heritage and making it more equitable. So it is something that is super important. And we do support in the city through things like arts and culture grants, because of course arts and culture are a huge part of intangible heritage and things like that. But heritage-specific focus is something that will hopefully be growing. The province is reopening the Heritage Conservation Act, and hopefully they'll be able to include some intangible heritage, and then hopefully they'll allow local governments to do that as well. But that's much in the future, but it is still something important to keep in mind. And that is it for the first topic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saretsky. Any questions for the first topic? We'll be able to have questions, of course, on this whole presentation at the end of your 5 topics, I believe. All right, let's move on. Go ahead, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Councillor Dell?
Just one quick question. I love the idea of intangible heritage. What were the 2, I saw a Scawfest photo, what were the other 2 photos? And then will we be making a submission to the province on our take on intangible heritage for the Heritage Conservation Act review? And if we do make a submission, what kind of things, I mean, something like Rifflandia comes to mind as this like cultural icon in the city, but there's lots more. Any thoughts on that?
Ms. Saretsky?
Yeah, thank you, through the mayor. So there's the Scawfest, and then working to the left, there is an image of one of our inaugural Indigenous artists in residence, Lindsay Delarond. And then on the far left is the Indigiqueer Pride after party. So I tried to get a good cross-section, but it is mostly events. Because events are, of course, part of intangible heritage. Yes, so the province did some totally engagement on the Heritage Conservation Act last fall. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend their sessions, but I do know that a lot of municipalities and just people in the heritage community sent in submissions specifically about things like intangible heritage, making the archaeology sections more inclusive and equitable. So they are working on it. I don't know where it's at right now. There is a webpage on the province's website about this project that will give you more updates, but they are hopefully working on it. It just depends on when the election happens, I understand. So,
Councillor Cardona.
Thanks, and through the mayor, thanks very much for the presentation so far. Just wanted to get a sense of, is there a cutoff date beyond which a building cannot be considered heritage? And is it possible to have newer buildings that are high-performing, aesthetically beautiful, low carbon, et cetera, be considered the heritage of the future?
Ms. Saretsky?
yes, thank you. Through the mayor. Yeah, we don't use a cutoff in Victoria. Some municipalities do. For example, Vancouver has a date that they use to determine whether or not something can be put on the heritage register. We don't have a date in Victoria, so a building built 2 years ago could be a heritage building. And that's absolutely something that we think about with new developments. We want to encourage the heritage buildings of the future to be built. So that's absolutely something that we think about in our guidelines and in our policies.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. Through the mayor, I have 2 questions which you don't need to necessarily answer now, but I just, as the presentations go on. The first is, I'm thinking of the Longhouse next to the museum and the ledge. How do we work with Indigenous, for lack of a better word, heritage, and how does that fit with our current framework for heritage and this colonial government and institution? And then the second question is, what are some challenges or struggles of heritage designation? Again, don't need to answer that right off the bat. Thanks.
Do those fit into the rest of your presentation, Ms. Zaretsky?
The heritage designation will be dealt with in the next topic, so hopefully I'll cover your question then. If not, please ask it again. But for the question about how do we incorporate Indigenous heritage and Indigenous culture, of course, the Local Government Act being grounded in real property does make it a bit difficult because, of course, so much of Indigenous heritage is intangible or isn't visible on the landscape anymore. And a lot of it is archaeological, which is the province's jurisdiction, not ours. So that's part of it as well. But for example, Thunderbird Park is, I believe, at least on the Heritage Register, if not designated. So there are examples where we have been able to designate Indigenous heritage sites in the city. And there's probably many sites that are designated and have Indigenous heritage, but maybe that's not obvious. And we need to do that work to add it in.
So
follow-up?
a follow-up question is, for example, with a proposed development coming online, there's suggestions to have like Lekwungen art or pieces on the land. And kind of going back to the earlier question, is there a way to designate heritage for things that are more contemporary but are still physical, real property and also a reflection of intangible heritage?
Absolutely. Oh, through the mayor, absolutely, we could do that. There'd have to, the property owner would have to be willing, and I'll get into that when I talk about heritage designations. But absolutely, if it's real property, we can technically designate it. So if they were willing to do that, we can also designate parts of parcels. So the part that is only where the art is, for example, that's definitely possible. But I don't believe it's been done yet.
Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Along particular ways along the shoreline and elsewhere, there are Indigenous areas that are very Indigenous historically. And I'm thinking here the shell beds around where the Huron bridges were going to be going in those areas. Are not those, I thought they were all captured already in some way, even if not under this program. Are they not already all captured, or not all, but several captured?
Yeah, through the mayor. So those would be likely archaeological sites, which are designated through the Heritage Conservation Act. So it's the province's archaeology branch who deals with those. And they're on the provincial register, though generally they're not public knowledge for protection reasons. So yeah, and known archaeology sites are protected, but through the province.
But you're not going to overlap them, I'm thinking, in some ways, given what we're saying, because I remember there was a big mistake that occurred, a huge boulder that was dug under and should have been left up because it had really significant geological significance, et cetera. So should there not be, or would you look forward to doing some kind of a bit of an overlap, so at least within the city boundaries, we do have some of it? And I understand, because especially along the Dallas Bluffs, that they don't want some of it known because they don't want people to go and destroy them, frankly. But should there not be some overlap, or besides just going off to the province to find out? Do you?
We absolutely could, but it's really up to the nations whether or not they want us to do that, because if we did designate it and we did put it on our register, it would become public knowledge. So it's up to them if they would want that. And then, of course, also the property owner, because often these sites are on private property. In some cases, they're on city property, so that changes the calculation. But if it's on private property, that complicates things.
Yeah, thank you, because I know Parks gave a presentation once on a lot of it that I quite enjoyed learning about it. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Zaretsky, on to part 2.
Wonderful. All right, so as I alluded to, topic 2 is about heritage recognition, protection, and permitting. And first up, I'm going to talk about the Heritage Register. So the Heritage Register is a list of registered, designated, and covenanted properties in the city. There's a municipal one, which is the one I'm talking about, but there's also a provincial and a national register as well. So currently, well, as of February, there was 978 properties on our Heritage Register. Of those, 357 were registered, 609 designated, and 12 covenanted. And whenever we make changes to the register, whether or not it's an addition or changing a statement of significance or clarifying something, we report those changes to the province so that they can update the BC Register of Historic Places, and then they pass that info on to the National Register, Canada's Historic Places. So there should be the same information on all three registers. And as I mentioned, the local government only deals with real property, so the register is only of real property. So for those 357 that are registered only and not designated or subject to a covenant, they're put on the register through a council resolution, and they don't have any legal protection. Permits are not required for changes to those properties unless they're located in a heritage conservation area, which I'll cover a little bit later in this section. The only restriction on those properties is that we cannot issue demolition permits until building permits are in place and approved for whatever is going to replace that register building. An example of a building that's on the Heritage Register but not in a heritage conservation area is Vic High, which is pictured here. For properties that are heritage designated, that comes about through a bylaw following a public hearing, and that designation is registered on title and it confers legal protection. Permits are required for changes to whatever the designated fabric is. Usually this is simply the exterior, but there are some properties that include interior features in their designations. Generally, we do heritage designation at owner request in the city, or it might be part of a large development as an amenity contribution. It's usually only owner initiated because we are required under the Local Government Act to pay compensation for the effects of designation on property values. And we do owner initiated because they then waive their right to compensation when they submit that application. So that's how that works right now. Technically, we can designate things without owner permission, but that does then have compensation in play. So that's how designation works in the city as of right now. And then heritage conservation areas are designated in the official community plan as opposed to by bylaw, though they still have a public hearing component. And we have 15 HCAs in the city as of February 1st. Some of those are in combination with development permit areas, and some of them are standalone HCA only. And in HCAs, registered and designated properties need permits according to a list of requirements and exemptions that are part of that designation and can be found in the official community plan. Common exemptions are things like if a non-heritage property wants to change their door or change their windows, they don't need a permit from us for that. Or for some heritage properties, if they want to paint, they don't need a heritage permit for that. But it does depend, and it does change between the heritage conservation areas. So all those exemptions are in the official community plan. And heritage conservation areas are really about shared heritage value and characteristics as opposed to individual, which is covered more by individual registration and individual designation. Heritage conservation areas should have that shared value and shared features, and that's what makes them different. Heritage covenants, they're not commonly used in the city. As I said, there's only 12 currently that we have, and that's a legal agreement registered on title. They provide protection and may include things like permit procedures, what fabric is actually protected and why, conservation requirements, the owner has to conserve it to this standard in this way by this time, maintenance responsibilities, and much more. It really can be a lot or anything because it is a legal agreement. They're not very common, as I said, so we generally tend to do designations instead, but we do have a few in the city. Heritage revitalization agreements are also something that we don't do too much of and are also a legal agreement between the property owner and the city. We have the power to do these through the Local Government Act, and they can be used to do things like vary zoning and other regulations. We don't use them a lot because we tend to use our heritage alteration permit process instead, but they are quite popular in other municipalities. And one of their uses is to ensure conservation happens in certain stages and in certain ways. So sometimes it is the right choice for a development. And one of those examples is Customs House at 888 Government, because it was quite a complex project and the conservation was quite complex. So there was a HRA in that case. So heritage alteration permits, I've alluded to them a few times, and we have two types that we use in the city. One is a straight heritage alteration permit, which is for substantial alterations and or added floor area, and that is a council decision. And we also have delegated heritage alteration permits, which are for minor alterations and delegated to staff. And these are required for designated buildings, registered buildings and HCAs, and covenants depending on the language in the covenant itself. No permit is required for like replacement or general maintenance. It's only when we're looking at changes that we start to look at permits. And this is an example of both types of permits. This is Kraft at 450 Swift. So when they wanted to convert to the Kraft restaurant, they wanted to expand their seating space. So they created an addition into the former patio, and that was a heritage alteration permit because it was added floor area. But then they discovered their renderings actually showed the roof in kind of a silver color, and they thought, we really like that actually. And we were in support because the roof probably originally would have been an unpainted metal for this industrial building. So when they came back and wanted to change the roof, that was a delegated permit because it was a minor alteration. So that's kind of how the difference shakes out. Both of these types of permits go to the Heritage Advisory Panel, which is 10 members appointed by council. They serve 3 consecutive 18-month terms, and then they have to take a term break before they can apply to be on the panel again. And they make recommendations via motions to council on heritage designations, heritage alteration permits, and heritage policy. And then they make comments to staff on delegated heritage alteration permits. They meet the second Tuesday of the month at noon. And in the past, they've had a council liaison. They haven't for the past little bit because of the governance review, but that has been how they've been set up. And this is 54 Government Street, which was designated a few months ago. And the report to council would have included a motion from HAPL recommending that designation. So that's an example of how you see their work over time. And then the final topic for this section is about the Heritage Property Maintenance Standards Bylaw. So this requires owners of heritage properties to keep them maintained to a certain standard, and it covers things like general maintenance, preventing weather and infestation, exterior finish and then what it should be, structural integrity, making sure buildings are safe and won't fall down or hurt anyone, as well as prompt graffiti removal, that it's done in a proper way and won't damage the building itself. It allows the city to go to the Supreme Court for an order of compliance or restoration. It also includes things like boarding up windows if a building is going to be vacant for a certain amount of time, which is what's shown here with Northern Junk. It's been vacant for more than 45 days, so the owners are following the Property Maintenance Standards Bylaw by boarding it up. And that's it for this one.
Great. That's part 2. Questions, council? Yep, go ahead, Councillor Hammond, then Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Excuse me if some of the information was in the report that I read, my eyes glazed over and I was looking forward to this. But on the heritage covenants, for example, any of the tax do all the tax benefits come up front? Come up front for people having heritage buildings?
Ms. Zaretsky?
Yeah, so covenants don't actually deal with tax exemptions. Tax exemptions are a different type of legal agreement, and actually that will be covered in the 3rd presentation today from my colleague, Crystal. So she'll go into that, how tax exemptions work.
Okay, so if it's not about those for the tax exemptions, and yes, they glazed over for that as well, then can I just ask this, the ongoing maintenance, let's say for something that is a covenant on title, is it 100% the responsibility of the owner of the building, or do they get funding elsewhere? Or do you know?
Ms. Zaretsky?
That depends on what's said in the covenant. The covenants might not cover maintenance, but it's something that they could cover, for example. So it really depends on the specific site and what it says.
Councillor Gardner.
My questions might be confusing because I'm a bit confused too, but that's okay. We've heard on different days a lot of discussions about the arts and innovation area coming up. And of course, you've just mentioned the junk buildings. How much of that is that falls within this, the whole heritage considerations?
Ms. Zaretsky?
Yeah, so part of Rock Bay is a heritage conservation area, actually. So there are definitely heritage considerations for the arts and innovation Industry, Arts, and Innovation District. Absolutely, and a lot of those buildings are designated as well. There's a few within the boundaries of that area. And there's also, it's an industrial landscape, so it has value for that reason too. I believe technically Northern Junk and the Grassini warehouse next to it are not in the boundaries of that plan, but they are designated buildings. So they were actually, that project was handled by the previous senior heritage planner when it came through council.
Okay, my second question, you might not be able to answer, but hopefully Andrea will. About 10 years ago, I know I was involved because the city was very concerned, again, because your municipal listing doesn't have that real protection. And it was with 520 Niagara because it was the Anglican property that had been at the Cathedral School, later Boy Scouts, and it was used for other community. And anyway, so about 10 years ago, there was a move by the city itself to rezone it such as to ensure that it would stay within a heritage because of that. What does that fall under any of this? Do you recall, Andrea?
Ms. Hudson?
Through the mayor, I know the site and the example that you're referencing. I don't recall what its status is, though, just on the top of my head. But it may be on the register. It may be designated. I'm not sure. We'd have to check. But certainly in our records, we would, we do show what the different heritage status is for properties throughout the city, and so we can certainly double check what the status is of that one for you.
Because that was a very important one and really stands out, and it's the foot, of course, of Medina Street. Okay, the other is, what is the relationship, or is there any, between the Heritage Advisory Panel and I'm going to get the words wrong, the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust? Is there any relationship at all between the two organizations or the two structures?
Ms. Zaretsky?
The trust can talk a little bit more about the relationship with their city when they do their presentation. But the Heritage Advisory Panel is an advisory committee of council, whereas the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust is an arm's length not-for-profit that was established by the city in, they're going to tell you the year, it's in the 80s, to give grants and do granting, and they receive funding from us. But HAPL is a city committee. So there are certainly people who are involved with both. But they are technically different organizations.
So just correct me, anything going to the Heritage Advisory Committee is stuff that helps to advise you and what have you in the various systems within the city, and the trust is strictly for the tax incentive. Is that more or less a division?
Ms. Zaretsky, is that going to be part of the secondary presentation?
Yeah.
They will definitely go into that, but generally, though, they also do grants. It's not just about the tax incentive, but they'll tell you all about all the great work that they do.
And my final question, which relates to you and to your colleague behind you, give us just a couple lines on the division of what is done within community planning versus the development area in your two different segments of heritage.
Ms. Zaretsky?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Ms. Hosa alluded to when she introduced me, I'm in community planning and Crystal is in development services. So I deal with a lot of our long-range planning, policy work, things like that. I do a lot of the heritage conservation area stuff, as well as supporting all of our other colleagues with the heritage pieces of the various other plans that are happening or have been worked on, whereas Crystal deals with development applications. Though I do assist her with those, I generally deal with heritage designations and delegated permits, just because it's more work than one person can do in terms of the heritage portfolio, but that's kind of the general line.
Councillor Cardona?
Thanks, Mayor, and through you to staff. Thanks for the presentation again, part two here. Just two questions for you. First, as you were talking about designation and registry and covenant, I was pondering whether or not there is ever circumstances in which property owners come to you in the attempt to designate, for instance, and it is determined that there is no heritage value. It's simply an old building. Or are all old buildings synonymous with heritage? Or does it ever happen where you say, this just has no heritage value, it's just an old, crappy building, it's not worth designated? Does that happen?
Ms. Zaretsky, is there a designation for old, crappy buildings?
Through the mayor, it's never happened in my time here. It certainly could happen. For example, if a building has actually been altered quite substantially over time and in quite a poor manner, and we determine those changes don't have value, we might say, oh, this doesn't meet the criteria. It hasn't happened. I don't think it happens very often, but it certainly could.
I guess as the follow-up, through the mayor, what's preventing just any block in the entire city coming to the city and saying, we deserve heritage status simply because we have some old houses on our block?
Ms. Zaretsky?
Thank you, through the mayor. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that later when we talk about the citizen-led heritage conservation area policy, because that's essentially what it allows people to do. But people absolutely could, and then we'd evaluate them. But I'll go into that a little bit more detail in the next section and in the conclusion.
Great, because I'd like to know more about what the criteria are. My final question for this section is, you talked about how the city has to pay compensation for any implications on property taxes, if I understood correctly, when there's a designation. Could you expand upon that and maybe give an example of how designation affects property values or property taxes and how the city is compensating for that?
Ms. Zaretsky?
Yeah, thanks, through the mayor. I maybe can't give a full explanation of how this works. It's a bit of a legal question as well. But it's for property value, not property taxes. And how that's determined is definitely an open question, because some people would say that designation adds property value. But of course, property owners who are going after compensation would say the opposite. So I believe it's usually determined through a third-party review. None of that has happened in my time here. I know there's some examples from way back in the day about that. But generally speaking, that's why we do the owner-initiated. So they waive the right to compensation when they apply, so then they can't ask for it later.
Okay, so the compensation would be more for an instance in which the city is pushing the issue of designation and it's thrust upon someone and they say this is a hardship and you have to compensate. But if it's owner pushed or owner led, then that's essentially waived. Okay, thanks.
Councilor Gardner, you had a follow-up?
Thank you. Again, on the overlap, I was interested in the archaeological and what have you. What is the overlap, for example, on art? If there is an art feature, there's actually historic, or could be viewed as historic. What would be the relationship between your art, not yours, the city's art kind of protection and art program versus the heritage?
Ms. Zaretsky?
Thank you, through the mayor. There's actually a lot of overlap between art and heritage. There's things that are both, absolutely. So if we're talking about an art feature that is permanently installed, it could be added to the Heritage Register, it could be designated. For example, some of the art pieces in Beacon Hill Park are considered character-defining elements in that designation. So that's an example of how the two work together and things are both.
Would the monoliths in Centennial Square in the fountain fall within that category?
They have no heritage status.
They have no heritage status? No, but from the art, okay. Even though heritage can be something made yesterday. Got it.
Absolutely. They aren't on our register or designated.
Thank you. Okay, on to part 3.
All right. Now, part 3 is heritage policies and guidelines. And first up is the official community plan. Section 8, placemaking, deals with both urban design and heritage. And the heritage goals within that are goals of conservation and recognition, continuing our programs and expanding them throughout the city. There's also a map of heritage landmarks and the heritage thematic framework in this section. The heritage landmark map is seen here, and it identifies prominent heritage buildings in the city and then also view radiuses of those buildings that we want to maintain from the public realm. So when we get proposals for developments within these radiuses, we evaluate them from, are they going to impact that public view of these prominent buildings, and then work with applicants to mitigate any impacts. Some of them are larger, such as the legislature or the Empress Hotel. Some of them are smaller, such as City Hall and its clock tower. But they're mostly concentrated in Old Town, but there's a smattering in other parts of the city, such as Craigdarroch is on there as well. And then the Heritage Thematic Framework is a section of themes that were put together when the consultation for the OCP happened. And we fit all of our heritage program within this framework. So we require statements of significance for new designations and new additions to the register to include a section at the bottom on how this property fits within our thematic framework. Is it part of what we've identified as the overall heritage of the city? And then we also include them for heritage conservation areas when we're making new ones or writing guidelines. We include a section in those statements of significance identifying how this HCA also fits within what we've identified as the heritage of the city overall. Next up is the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, or the standards and guidelines as we all call them, because that's quite a title. This is the National Heritage Best Practices Policy from which we get statements of significance, and it's kind of centered around the idea that a historic place will have a statement of significance, and it's really the underpinning of this. It's been adopted by the city as policy, so we use it to guide our decision-making around heritage. And it's basically standards for heritage planning philosophy and approach, and then guidelines for conservation best practices. It's a very long document, and there's a lot of stuff in there, but if I could sum it up in one idea, it would be to investigate a historic place to first understand it, and then make informed conservation decisions based on the heritage value as represented in character-defining elements, and ensure that those conservation decisions are guided by the ideas of minimal intervention, ongoing maintenance, and continuous documentation of the work that's being done. Most heritage-specific policy documents that we have reference these because they are kind of the overarching best practices that we use. And one of the key things about them is that they're not prescriptive or hierarchical. They're very flexible because heritage is very much a case-by-case thing. If I want you to leave here today with one thing, it's that heritage is so case-by-case. You can't have any kind of say something and it applies to all of heritage because it is so specific. And it's really about not freezing things in time, but managing change. And that's kind of the idea of what heritage is. That's underpinned this document and a lot of heritage work in Canada, is that heritage is the management of change, not the prevention of change. This is an example of what the guidelines look like. Like I said, there's a lot of them, and they go from things like dealing with cultural landscapes, archaeological sites, industrial sites, all the way to the super specific, how to deal with wood interior features. This is an example from the guidelines for exterior form. And they all look like this, a category of recommended on one side, not recommended on the other. And they all go from least invasive to most invasive. So starting with understanding and documenting, and then getting into actually making changes to whatever category they're dealing with at the time. Our local area plans in the city, and this is of course just a smattering of the more recent ones we've done. Heritage is embedded throughout all of these plans. It occurs in all of them. And each plan is different because, of course, each neighborhood is different, but they may include area history and the heritage values of a specific area. They might include a heritage inventory of that neighborhood. For example, Burnside Gorge includes a heritage inventory. And goals for neighborhood-specific conservation are also sometimes within these. For example, Victoria West identified a couple areas that could be heritage conservation areas when that plan was adopted as well. So heritage is throughout all of our planning in the city, even if it's not a heritage-specific policy or document. Our Old Town Design Guidelines, which are award-winning and considered some of the best that are out there in BC, deal with the Old Town Heritage Conservation Area. And it includes a statement of significance for Old Town, as well as supplementary statements of significance for Chinatown and the waterfront, because they have their own special character and needs. And then guidelines for new builds, additions, and infill within the area, with additional guidelines for Chinatown and the waterfront, again, reflecting their specific and important values that are a little bit different from the rest of Old Town. Our other design guidelines follow that same principle and format as the Old Town Design Guidelines. We currently have 2 like that in the city, which are for Fernwood Village, which is a heritage conservation area, and then also Robert Street, which is a heritage conservation area, the first, as of yet, only that has been put in place through the citizen-led policy, which I'll cover in just a little bit. And it was actually the place that was identified in the Victoria West Plan as a place that should maybe be a HCA. So that's kind of full circle for that one. But again, they follow that same format as the Old Town Design Guidelines, statement of significance, and then guidelines for new builds, alterations, and infill. Our guidelines for fences, gates, and shutters, also another policy that's not heritage specific, but does include heritage guidance in it. Generally speaking, these guidelines follow crime prevention through environmental design or CPTED practices, but they include specific callouts for when you're dealing with a heritage building, that any kinds of gates, shutters, or fences should be designed as sympathetic to the architecture of the place. They should look like they've always been there, not that they've been added in, and they shouldn't block any views of heritage buildings. They should be very transparent and allow the heritage building to still shine. Often, these kinds of things do require a heritage alteration permit or a delegated permit. Not always, it depends on how they interact with the heritage fabric, but generally speaking, they would come through either myself or Crystal as a heritage alteration permit. But we do apply these as well to heritage buildings. And then finally, I've alluded to it a couple times, the citizen-led heritage conservation policy was adopted in 2019, and it allows citizens to nominate their street to be a potential HCA. Those HCA nominations are then evaluated for shared value and shared character. We request that when they do the nomination, they have provided information on the history of the street as much as possible and the individual buildings on it, given us a map of what they think the boundary should be, as well as provided us with information on how many of their neighbors they're talked to and what the neighborhood support level for this idea is. And then staff will go and look at it, do some more preliminary research, and then come to council and ask for direction on whether or not it should be further studied based on what we found in our investigation and with the nominators. And then if we get permission to study it or we've recommended to further study it, we do more in-depth work. We write the statement of significance and guidelines, hold some community meetings discussing it and making sure it is right for this place, and then come back to council and go through the steps to make it into an actual HCA. So that's how this is laid out. We've only done one yet, that's Robert Street, as I mentioned previously. There's one that we're working on, will hopefully come to you soon in the next few months. That's almost the end of the process. And there's a few in the queue. And of course, you will have seen that we have a recommendation about this policy, but that we'll deal with that a little bit more. And I'll talk about the challenges and why we've come with that recommendation a little bit later in the conclusion. And that's it for this topic.
Any questions on part 3? No? So super clear. I'm not suggesting the rest wasn't, but obviously that was particularly clear. Let's move on to part 4.
Wonderful. All right, so part 4 will be super quick because other people are talking about the bulk of this today, actually. But this is about our programs and partner organizations that we have for the Heritage Program in the city. And first up, the Tax Incentive Program provides tax exemptions for up to 10 years and incentivizes seismic upgrading of designated buildings in 2 streams, residential and non-residential. The Victoria Civic Heritage Trust and my colleague Crystal will be doing much more in-depth information on this program later today, but that's just the quick overview of what it is, just so you know that we have it as part of our program offerings, but they'll go much more in depth on that later. One of our 2 partner organizations is the Victoria Heritage Foundation, which was created in 1983 by the city to take over a grant program that was giving grants to owners of single-family heritage homes to do conservation work. At the time, that wasn't something we could technically do, so we moved it over to them. And they're a nonprofit, and they receive annual funding for both those grants and for operational expenses from the city. They also have a mandate to provide education on heritage in the city, and their eligible properties that they deal with are properties that are heritage designated and were originally single-unit residences. So those properties might now be something like a store or multi-unit, but they had to have been single-unit when they were built to fall under the Victoria Heritage Foundation's purview. And then the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust, who of course is with us today and will tell you a little bit more about themselves, but they're similar setup to the foundation, arms-length not-for-profit that receives annual funding from the city for operational and grant programs. They also assist with a tax incentive program, and their eligible properties are designated properties and basically the ones that the foundation doesn't cover, so ones that are not single units. They do multi-unit residential as well as commercial and institutional buildings. This section was super quick, and that's it for that one.
Well, I think partly that's because we're expecting an opportunity to go into a lot more detail in some subsequent presentations. But are there any specific questions for Ms. Zaretsky on this particular section? Councillor Gardner?
Thank you. So we have kind of 5 organizations. So we got your section, or i.e. community planning section of Heritage, then we have the development planning, then we have the Heritage Advisory Panel, and we've got the Victoria Heritage Foundation, and we got the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust. Okay, so the 2 external ones are the foundation and the trust. So just to clarify in my mind, so the trust we're going to get into more, and it's more the tax exemption. The foundation is grants for individual homes, right? Now, the Heritage Trust is tax exemption 10 years. The grant also has a component of obligation, does it not? In other words, grants are given for certain things, but it, because the municipal isn't, it's not a, is there some kind of guarantee because we don't have the same kind of protection as the provincial and federal? Is there a length of time or something that is connected to the to that particular grant?
And Ms. Zaretsky, just for the record, because you were being very agreeable and nodding in response to Councillor Gardner's questions, but for those folks who are listening to us or being audio, I'll just note that you did in fact say yes to those earlier questions.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, through the mayor. Yes, so there's the 3 city pieces, and then there's the 2 arm's length organizations. For the Heritage Foundation, their grants, they offer grants up to a certain limit every 10 years. So there's a maximum that heritage homeowners can ask for and get within that 10-year time frame. And all of the things that they fund has to be conservation work on designated heritage fabric. So for most of these homes, that's the exterior of the home, but it could include features such as a rock wall or interior features if they're listed in the designation bylaw, but that's the only things they can provide grants for. And they have a system where they do all of their intake at once, and then those grants are evaluated by a set of volunteer home inspectors who have a heritage background and make sure that the work that's being done is to conservation standards and is the kind of work we want to see. And then those inspectors actually go and do an inspection at the end of the work too, and they have to pass that inspection in order to get the grant money.
Thank you. Any other questions in this part? Councillor Loughton, is that a hand up or no? Okay. Moving on then to part 5. Thank you.
All right, our last topic before we get to the conclusion section, this is about, just it will be a brief one as well, alignment with other city strategies. So our first up, the Climate Leadership Plan. This includes an action which says collaborate with heritage organizations to identify and promote energy retrofitting opportunities for homeowners. And with this is within my portfolio, and I have been working at it. And we're working with the CRD and their Navigator tool team to make sure that the information that they're giving homeowners is accurate for heritage concerns, and that they know that, for example, retrofits that work in modern buildings don't necessarily work in heritage buildings, and ways that they can get that information and pass that on to homeowners. Also working, of course, with our climate team here in the city to make sure that those heritage concerns and features are embedded into all the work we do on this. And then also I've been working with the Victoria Heritage Foundation. I'm their staff liaison, so I don't sit on their board, but I attend their board meetings and I help them out. And we're working together to make sure that the information that they provide people includes information on how to retrofit their buildings, but also talking about some of the things that they already do that is good for the climate and good for buildings, but just maybe isn't talked about that way, such as storm windows. So to include that information. They're redoing their website this year, and they'll be including that information when that is unveiled. And we're talking about, is there more funding we can do within the parameters that they exist in that would be for climate retrofits. The next framework is the accessibility framework. This is also within my portfolio, this action. Consider incentives to encourage accessibility of heritage buildings. We've begun thinking about ways that we could go about doing this. Of course, some of the city's own programs already do this, not specifically heritage specific, but the arts and culture infrastructure grants sometimes do include accessibility upgrades to heritage buildings just because they're home to an arts or culture organization. So we are sort of funding it, just not heritage specific or explicit. And of course, the trust will talk a little bit about what they do, but sometimes that does include access as well, some of their grant programs. So nothing specifically explicitly for accessibility, but it is something that is happening, and we're starting to think more about and how maybe we can make that a bit more explicit in terms of grants for homes and heritage buildings. And then finally, the last strategy, the Victoria Housing Strategy. This doesn't include specific actions or call-outs for heritage, but of course, heritage buildings are a huge part of our housing stock, so it is a necessary piece of the strategy. And conversions and adaptive reuse are one of the key ways. Gentle density has been for decades and will be added to our neighborhoods. We've been doing conversions of houses since the 40s. And of course, some of our building stock in our neighborhoods was never single-family homes. There's many duplexes and small-scale residential buildings that are just as old as the single-family homes next to them. Missing middle also included specific call-outs and carve-outs for heritage-conserving infill. And we really looked at, okay, so this building type has technically always existed in our city. How can we take inspiration from the heritage buildings that are missing middle buildings and incorporate that into our design guidelines and how we consider neighborliness and context and things like that. And yeah, historic homes are a key part of gentle densification and consider densification in our neighborhoods. And that's part of what we're thinking about whenever we think about housing. That's it. This is my final question slide.
Thanks, Ms. Retzky. Councillor Carradona.
Thanks, Mayor, and through you. I want to ask, bring up the S word, which is seismic, which didn't get mentioned too much in these presentations, and just want to get a better sense of how seismic concerns and considerations enter into our heritage policy. And we all know that the BC Building Code is having a major seismic upgrade, I think January 1st of next year, which is going to make restoration, I think, even more challenging. I'd just like to get a better sense of how we balance or approach the desire to maintain a certain aesthetic with the very important need and demand to have seismic safety. Does aesthetics ever take precedence over safety? Or how do we balance that really difficult topic?
Ms. Retzky.
Thank you, through the mayor. So that will be touched on much, much more in depth with the presentation on the tax incentive, because of course the tax incentive is for seismic upgrading. That's specifically what it's about. So we'll get much more into the details on that one. I will note that the Victoria Heritage Foundation has started including seismic projects in what they'll fund. So far, I believe they've only received one project about that. But of course, it's not just our big buildings downtown that are at risk, it's homes as well. So it is being included in grant programs in that way as well. It's a big topic. And of course, it's the classic heritage thing where each building is so unique that what would be appropriate for one building would be very inappropriate for another, or not actually have the desired effect and things like that. So it's very considered. I know we just dealt with a permit for some of the society buildings in Chinatown with their parapets, doing external visible bracing, but it's done in such a way that it's not going to be obtrusive, it's not going to detract, but it will still definitely be visible and people will know that they've done that. So there's ways to do both for sure, but they'll get much more in depth later today.
Thank you.
Councillor Kim.
Thank you. Through the mayor, has there ever been any consideration to supporting heritage buildings based on the interior? I'm thinking Victoria is known among locals for its rodents, especially older buildings. And so there are associated higher maintenance costs with pest, maintenance and prevention programs. Has that ever been considered?
Ms. Retzky.
Yeah, thank you, through the mayor. So we are bound by what legislation allows us to give grants and incentives for, and that is just for conservation work on heritage fabric. So if an interior is considered heritage fabric, it's designated, then we can provide funds for example, maintenance, which could include like closing holes that they're getting, and like things like that. But the kind of general maintenance stuff, which would be what pest control and things like that fall under, we aren't able to provide financial incentives for.
Thank you. And then going back to my earlier question, throughout your presentation, it was very clear examples like covenants, for example, can be quite challenging for maintenance and other pieces. But are there other examples outside of covenants where heritage designation could provide challenges or difficulties for neighbors, owners, the city, anything that might not have been addressed sooner?
Ms. Retzky.
Yeah, thank you. There's definitely, some of it is maybe perceived challenges. we definitely get inquiries from prospective homeowners who are looking at buying, for example, a designated property. And you can tell they're coming from the assumption that they won't be able to make changes, when of course that's not the case. You just have to get a permit, and even then it's only for the heritage fabric. So if you want to do a total gut reno, if it's not designated, that doesn't require that extra hoop from us. So it's that we definitely deal with misconceptions around designation, where the assumption that it is freezing it in time or that it's going to be impossible to get approval for things, whereas we very much take the view that, again, heritage is the management of change, and that we want the city to change because a changing city is a vibrant city, and that's what heritage should be serving and be part of. And we want to work with people so that their buildings work for them, but then also maintain those heritage value. That's why we use heritage value and character defining elements, because there might be buildings where some features, we can absolutely let them go for safety reasons, accessibility reasons, seismic reasons, because they aren't actually contributing to the value of the place. That's where those evaluation tools come in. But yeah, there's definitely that perception that that's not the case and that it's freezing it in time. And of course, there's challenges, for example, with insurance, and things like that. It's just a difficult insurance industry right now for everyone, and things like that. But we provide information where we can and try and work with people to make it good for everyone and a good outcome from everyone. So.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Coleman.
Thank you. This section is on alignment with other city strategies. Sometimes our policies are at loggerheads with one another, and we have to work through that. But I assume the alignment also goes with other orders of government as well. So we want to come into alignment with provincial or federal regulations in this. How do you manage that is the question. And it may be theoretical that you need more time to explain, but I would like to try and understand the process of how that alignment goes, not just internally, but externally.
Ms. Zaretsky?
Yeah, that is a big question, and I'm always going to say it depends with heritage, but it does depend a little bit on what exactly is the case of misalignment and needing to come into alignment. For example, building code and its changes were referenced, so of course that's going to affect what people can do in heritage buildings. It might require us to give up some heritage features just because safety trumps that or code trumps that. And seismic obviously will be very much affected by that. It's a case of working with our counterparts at other levels, having that open dialogue for sure, and looking at things that come down, the changes that come down, and say, okay, how can we work with this? I realize that's a very broad answer, but I know that's what we're going to be considering when building code changes, for example, or when the Heritage Conservation Act hopefully changes. We'll then be looking at how that affects us and working with it.
Thank you. It was a very broad question, so a very broad answer is absolutely fine. But it does have, I suspect, a looming implication for us as we deal with some of the intangible areas and trying to get all orders of government to come into alignment with that. And I think that may show up in other areas as well. So it's just a caution as we go forward.
All right, Ms. Zaretsky, I think you have a conclusion with some recommendations.
I absolutely do. So our conclusion is about future directions of the program. We were pioneers for heritage programs in Canada. I hope that I made that clear in the introduction. We've been doing this for a very long time, in often very innovative ways. Sometimes the legislation had to catch up with us and things like that. But our program actually hasn't changed all that much recently, including a lot of municipalities who are just onboarding a heritage program now have found ways to, for example, deal with intangible heritage, or to be much less focused on buildings or architecture and things like that. So we're kind of starting to think about ways that we can expand our program, make it more equitable, make it more community-centered and community-focused, and how we can still, value the architecture and stuff and what's made our program so important up until now and is part of what makes Victoria such a special place, but then add in those layers. So a couple examples of how we're hoping that will happen is with the OCP 10-year review. I will be involved in this. Heritage will absolutely be woven through the whole project as we move to a more citywide planning and zoomed out approach as we're looking at how we can densify, how we can make the city a place for everyone. And Heritage will absolutely be at the table for that. It's an opportunity to shift the program to that kind of more community-centered approach, hopefully make it more equitable and more representative of the people who live here now, and just asking people what makes Victoria Victoria to them, and then using that to inform our heritage decisions, but also our decisions about other aspects that this will cover, including things like housing, transportation, open spaces, parks, all that stuff. So it will definitely be, hopefully, be able to expand the program through this project as it moves forward. Another example of how we're trying to integrate and expand the Heritage program is through the Government Street Refresh. I've also been involved with this program, and it's an opportunity to correct the narrative of the street, to add those voices that are currently missing. It's, of course, a very important heritage street. It's iconic. It's well known. But there's some things it's silent on, and how, through our refresh, can we then add in those stories and represent them in a considered way and add that heritage, enhance the heritage through that. It's a chance to look at how we interpret our stories, how we tell our stories, and what's ways we can make that more inclusive going forward. And the hope is that this will then be a way that we can then jump off this project and implement similar ideas in other places in the city. And then finally, I come to the citizen-led HCA policy review, which will then is what the recommendation is about. So this policy was put into place in 2019, and because of that, it doesn't align with all our current city policies and goals, such as the equity, diversity, and inclusion framework. And the move to citywide planning does affect this. As we zoom out for the OCP, we're likely to find potential heritage conservation areas, for example. We're looking at the whole city as a whole, as opposed to the citizen-led policy is very zoomed in to specific blocks. So as we step back, it's an opportunity to actually look at this policy and say, is it doing what we need it to do? It has been a bit inequitable in practice. When we put it into place, we were hoping that we'd hear from people we don't usually hear from. We'd look at heritage conservation, potential heritage conservation areas that represent communities or building types that hadn't been represented yet. But unfortunately, that hasn't really happened. Robert Street, which is pictured here, is the exception that proves the rule. It was our first one, and it includes a home type that isn't represented very well in our heritage program. But all the other nominations we've received under this program have been for very traditional, late 19th, early 20th century homes that are very well represented as it stands right now. So we want to really do a review and zoom out and say, okay, so this isn't exactly, it hasn't shook out exactly how we thought it would. Is there things we need to change to make sure that we are being equitable? We haven't heard from communities that are well represented, so clearly we need to change something to fix that, and things like that. This leads into our recommendation. One of our nominations can definitely be considered as part of the OCP 10-year review, but the others, we need direction on how we're going to deal with that, knowing that this policy isn't quite working the way we want it to work. It's not doing quite what we want it to do. So that is where this recommendation for an ask for direction is coming from. And that's my final slide, and that's where we'll end it. So thank you. I can answer questions on the other parts of this conclusion or on the recommendation.
Well, thanks, Ms. Zaretsky. I appreciate the depth of that presentation and your curious emphasis on managing change. There are two recommendations before Council. One is simply to receive, but the other is a direction with regard to the CHCAs. First, I'll ask one question. Are there any questions that have not been asked that are material to anyone's ability to make a decision on these recommendations? Okay. Oh, Councillor Kim, go ahead.
Councillor Gardner. It's not a question pertaining to the presentation, but given that we're going to hear from the citizen-led group, it feels a little disingenuous to make a decision prior to hearing from them. So is it possible to delay this until later in the day?
You are certainly able to move any motion that would postpone this to a particular time. If you do that, it will end debate, as you know.
Okay, I'll think on it while my colleague.
Okay. I believe I saw Councillor Cardona and then Councillor Gardner.
I'll move the staff recommendation right now.
Okay.
So permit for
there's
comments
always
and
an
questions.
opportunity to postpone something before we vote, so that's perfectly in order. Is there a seconder for the recommendation? Councillor Dell is seconding, so we'll start as we always do with the mover and seconder, and then we'll go to other questions and comments.
Thanks, Mayor. I certainly have had considerable concern from James Bay, and I'm the liaison there, and so I wanted to mention that as a comment, but also ask some additional questions, even though it's now been moved. I am deferring to staff judgment here. I'm not an expert on these things, and I recognize that the 10-year OCP review is an extraordinary amount of work, and I imagine a lot of this just simply comes down to capacity. So in my attempts to carry a message back to James Bay, just to clarify, would it be correct to say that this work is being put on pause really for 2 or 3 reasons? One is around capacity related to OCP. The other is the need to make sure that HCA is aligned with current city policy. And the third is maybe to clarify what the standards are so that there are more objective or clear standards and also that it's more equitable. I'm trying to figure out how I'm carrying this message back. Sorry, thank you.
Ms. Hudson, would you like to take a crack at that?
Yes, through the mayor, I think that's a correct characterization. We do just want to take a pause. We want to, we've lived with the policy for a little while. It's not performing as we anticipated, so we do want to have a look at it and make sure it aligns with our housing strategy and our equity framework. We also want to take the opportunity to take a more holistic approach when we consider heritage conservation areas, and the OCP 10-year review is a perfect opportunity to do that. And one of the struggles I think that we're having with this is that a nomination will come in and we as staff look at it, but we're essentially looking at it in isolation. A good example that I would use of I think a better way to do it is through our recent village and corridor planning process, where staff planned for the future of Fernwood Village. And Fernwood Village is a small urban village, and it's a heritage conservation area. And we looked at that area as well as the areas surrounding it. And staff considered a multitude of things. They considered future land uses, including housing and commercial use. They considered the boundaries, the extent of the village itself, the public realm, mobility. They considered guidelines for heritage buildings that exist and for new infill buildings to ensure that they complemented the character of those buildings. And so all of those things are very much interrelated with one another, and I think the outcomes of the future of the Fernwood Village really, I think it was a really good result, and because staff were able to really think about how all those things affect one another. And so I think what we're suggesting here is we want to put this policy on pause. We want to do the OCP 10-year review, and we want to look at some of our other villages, like James Bay Village, which hasn't had recent local area planning yet, and one of the nominations that we have received happens to be in the boundary of the village. And so I think we would like to consider that as part of that work. So yes, that's a very long answer to your question of how to characterize this, but yes.
Councillor Gardner, so you're done. Councillor Dell is the seconder.
No, I'm just going to say I'm happy to move forward with the staff recommendation here. I think it's just been a lot of good work in this presentation. It's one of the biggest we've received so far, so thanks for all your preparation there. I do like the citywide approach because I'm in the South Jubilee neighborhood, where we also have a bunch of beautiful heritage buildings in that neighborhood as well. Probably a lot of streets that could be designated heritage streets, not to mention Gonzales and Rocklands and Fairfield. And so I think using our limited resources widely to kind of take a citywide approach on how we can maintain a lot of that, because there's a lot I wouldn't want to lose in my own area as well and throughout the city. So this seems to be like using our limited resources as wisely as possible, this approach. So I am supportive of that, and just recognizing how much work has gone into this, preserving the city's heritage over the last 30, 50 years. It's just really incredible how many people before us have done a lot of work on this, and I think sometimes we aren't recognized as much how much has been put into preserving some of these incredible buildings. So it was really nice to see some of those, particularly the Mountain Equipment Co-op building was one that stood out to me. I don't remember a time when it was boarded up like that, but geez, they really did a phenomenal job at revitalizing that. So I'm really happy with the heritage programs we have in place, and some tweaks here and there are always going to be challenging, but I think this one will help strengthen the program. So thanks for your work.
Thank you, Councillor Gardner, and then Councillor Hammond.
Thank you. I had questions before I got moved. Unfortunately, didn't get a chance to speak. I noticed, and I could be wrong, but of your proposals, they appear to be the ones that were submitted late last year were James Bay, and I don't know when South Turner's was, but the other ones appeared late in December or sometime. The dates weren't there. I'm quite concerned about this. When you gave your presentation, you of course showed the local area plans and how the work had been done there, and also Government Street, how it had been done there. And of course, the James Bay has not been done, and the new OCP overlook is not going to be the same kind of consultation and same kind of approach that was taken with the LAPs that you described. So I find that somewhat worrisome. And when I look at the Government Street one, I just keep looking at what we've got and what you're doing, in a very positive way, I believe, on Government Street. And then when you keep heading further south, you pass the legislature, you pass the Queen's Printer, you pass the bird cages, confectionery, one of the oldest in the country. You pass it and you go right down to part of the one application, I think, because I haven't seen it, right through the Lewis House, right down to Dallas. And that street plus the Medina, which is near between there and Menzies, are of course the only north-south streets within James Bay that really capture the whole visitor economy and everyone that lives in hotels that are heading down towards Dallas or anything else. Those are the heritage walking streets, the most common ones in the city of Victoria. And that is why I would not like to see this delayed a couple of years, but to go forward because of those James Bay ones. And I think that would be very important. And I also understand, but I don't have the exact numbers, that there's only less than 10%, is that right, of the housing stock left in James Bay? Because James Bay is so densely occupied. And of course, a lot of those heritage houses are already flatted. In other words, they're multi-residential to a certain extent. Is that right? There's less than 10% left of housing stock?
Ms. Hudson, is that something you know off the top of your head?
Through the mayor, no, I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Okay, that's okay. But anyway, it's small because we have all the rest. So I would like, and I'm not sure what Councillor Kim was trying to say because I didn't quite hear her at the end, as to whether or not number 2 could be put off to a later date. Is that, I don't sure what she was thinking.
I think I understood Councillor Kim to be suggesting that she might wish to consider this entire motion after a subsequent presentation later today. Is that correct? Yeah.
Oh, just for today.
So not necessarily after today.
Okay, and I would actually like at this time to move that the second point be, altered. And that
You're wanting to make an amendment?
Yes, I'm not too sure how.
What
Okay,
purpose are you
receive
trying
no
to
new
find?
nominations, no problem. So to delete the that part. Yeah, keep going.
Likely on not processing any current nominations that have not already been received. Is that
Well, yeah, right down to the next comma. Keep going down. Whoa. To delete that.
okay? That's your amendment? Delete that wording?
Pardon?
Your amendment is to delete that wording?
Yes.
It's okay. Could you bold that up, please, staff, so we can see it? All right, yes, very good. Is there a seconder for that amendment? Councillor Coleman is seconding for discussion. Go ahead, Councillor Gardner. Just on the amendment, please.
Yeah, I think I said a lot before I actually made the amendment.
Yes, indeed.
Which was a lot of the work has been done in the other areas. In the OCP process, the current OCP that exists, of course, James Bay was supposed to be done first. And for various political reasons and other reasons, it was not. And so it is down at the end. And now the consultation that's going on is not going to be the same in depth that was at that time. That's been quite clarified, not only the opportunities for engagement, but the style of engagement. And I think that I haven't seen these projects. I've just seen one of them. And the work that went into it I found was incredible. It's a 30-page submission with the age of everything, including the walls. And so I was very impressed with what I've seen, but I cannot judge them because I am not in Heritage. But a lot of work's gone into it, and that was 7 or 8 months ago, I guess, somewhere in there, 6, 7, 8 months ago. I don't know that all the work would have been done before that, because of course they don't do that kind of work in one day. So this is for that community, for those, I don't know, all three of the different ones you have, has been going on for maybe a year, I don't know, for each of those neighborhoods or blocks or areas. So I would like to see it proceed, but not to have any more new nominations.
Thank you. Councillor Coleman as the seconder.
I understand that this allows the current ones that are in stream to carry on, which is, I think, a good thing. Given that section 5 in your presentation was about alignment, I actually have a problem putting the citizen-led heritage conservation areas on pause. I think that I recognize that it's messy, it's an ongoing process that's never fun, but community building is often messy. I think that this is an area that is critically important as we move forward and continue to evolve. I can support the amendment, but I'm probably going to vote against number 2, and I would ask to sever unless we put it off until after the second set of presentations, because I think this is critical to the ongoing process, and I recognize that it puts great strain on staff, and I'm sorry about that. I know you're already overtaxed on the work you do, but it is the discussion with the community on how we move forward together on an area that we want to love and embrace and watch evolve. Thank you.
Thank you. On the amendment only, please. Councillor Caradona.
Mayor, I was going to ask you, are you going to roll this in or out of order, given that it substantively erases the intent of the second bullet? To my mind, it's not in order.
Yeah, I thought about that, but I actually think it is in order because although it is somewhat different, certainly, it doesn't undermine the initial part of Part 2, which is about receiving no new nominations. If this were to be approved, this amendment, we'd have to actually change a word in the rest of the sentence and replace "and" with "until," and then the note of this would simply be that there would be no new nominations received until staff report back. So I don't think that this undermines the essence of number 2.
Okay. In that case, I'll argue against the amendment on the grounds that I think our staff have been pretty clear in saying that there are capacity issues, that the current program is not working as originally intended, it doesn't align with city policy, and there's some pretty substantive equity issues at stake here. So for all of those reasons, I'm inclined to agree with the need to push pause. And I think every minute that would be dedicated to dealing with the current proposals would be a moment that's taken away from dealing with the OCP. And we as a council have given pretty clear direction to expedite that process on a very truncated timeline, in part because some neighborhoods like James Bay lack an updated LAP and they need an updated official community plan. So I think that this sends a mixed message if this were to pass to our staff who need to be dedicating their time to the 10-year review. So for that reason, I'll have to argue against the amendment.
Thank you. Councillor Kim.
I have a question for the move-in seconder where the amendment actually doesn't, the amendment removes an end to the pause. So it would be on pause indefinitely. Is there...
Sorry, unless, as I mentioned, if this is adopted, we'd have to make a subsequent amendment to change the word "and" to "until," because you would then read...
Okay, great. Sorry,
pause
I
the
missed
citizen
that.
heritage conservation areas receiving no new nominations until staff have reported back, etc.
Thank you. I'll speak against the amendment, however, regardless. We've seen how some of the projects that have come down the pipe that were submitted prior to Missing Middle are kind of caught in this limbo, and I would hate to actually see something similar happen given the OCP changes and review that's going to be underway. So I'll be voting against the amendment. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else on the amendment? Councillor Hammond.
And this is on the amendment.
Just the amendment,
yes. How long do we expect the pause to take place? In the original, in other words, what we'd be removing, how long would we expect the pause? Are we talking months? Are we talking years? And how many?
There was an allusion earlier in a comment that it would be years. Is it years? months, a year? What's your estimate?
Through the mayor, I think what we were envisioning is that Laura, in her heritage planner role in the policy group, would be devoting her time to supporting the official community plan 10-year review because of the heritage being a strong component of that. So that work would be delayed. There would be some resource challenges if she had to, I guess, devote her time to processing the applications that are currently in. That said, while she was intending to support the OCP 10-year review, we were planning on immediately tackling an update to the citizen-led heritage conservation areas policy. So I don't have a specific time frame for you, but I think we're thinking as soon as we can. So, within the coming year or months, not years, I would say definitely not years. It's something we wanted to do right away.
Thank you.
And you might have answered that, but my next question is, then with this amendment going ahead, what would be the practical realities for your department?
Through the mayor, I think we will have to do some thinking internally about what the absence of having our heritage planner would do to the OCP 10-year review, and we may need more resources for hiring a heritage consultant to help with one of these things, to shift the work around. I don't know if Director Huza has anything she would like to add to that, but yeah, we would need to do that thinking because it would definitely hurt the timeline.
Ms. Huza, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Mayor. I just did want to emphasize we have two heritage planners. One is fully on development permits, and Ms. Zaretsky is our policy planner. We think it's incredibly important to have her involved in the 10-year OCP review. We can't have her involved in the 10-year OCP review and reviewing the citizen-led applications as well. So, that goes to what Ms. Hudson said. We would have to be looking for additional resources or trying to find different ways of juggling multiple things. I also just wanted to emphasize that, one of the applications is something that we actually are looking at dealing with through the 10-year OCP review. It may not be in the same form as the citizen-led application, but the village area is an important component of that. So it would actually be looked at as part of this process, and I believe that then leaves two that were received at the end of last year on pause as we look at this more citywide approach. I guess I'll stop at that, but we are very, very tight on resources, and I just, we may need to have to come back to council with other solutions than for resources, and all of this will have impacts on timelines.
Thank you. Anyone? Councillor Hammond, do you finish?
Yes, no, Mayor, through you, then how long do we expect the 10-year OCP to be completed? And you might have already said that.
Ms. Hudson.
Through the mayor, we proposed a 2-year process, so coming back to you, and I think Q2 of 2024.
Okay, thank you. And then one last thing is, are there any of the nominations, the current nominations, that you are working on that have received council direction?
Ms. Zaretsky.
Yes, so we've received council direction on only 1 Lewis Street, which isn't actually affected by this recommendation. It's in process. It's almost ready to come back to council for final decision and final process. So that's the only one where we've received direction on. The other 3 have not been to council at all yet.
Ms. Hudson.
Through the mayor, my apologies. I meant to say Q2 of 2025 for the OCP.
I thought that was, wow, we were really accelerating things there. I know we were asking a lot, but on the amendment, anyone else on the amendment? Councillor Gardner.
I'm sorry, you were correct. I shouldn't have deleted the whole thing. It should have ended after direction instead of down to the comma. So I don't know if we can make an amendment to my amendment. Can I?
Certainly you can. So you would like to remove the emphasis.
Remove the
after
deletion.
Direction. Yes, that's right.
put that back to
Councillor
regular.
Coleman, are you satisfied with that clarification, or would you like to do it more formally as an amendment to an amendment? You're fine with that? Okay. So if we can just remove that bold and strike through and then have a chance to read it again. Councillor Gardner and Coleman, that is what you intend? Just what's bolded and struck through there?
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments on the amendment itself? No, I would just say that I know I'm supportive of what I believe is the intent, but I'm not going to be able to support the amendment just for the reasons that have been stated by staff. And in particular, I think that the work that's going to be done through the OCP review in an accelerated, though perhaps not quite as accelerated as we indicated, is going to have an impact on this and vice versa. And I think that that's an important synergy. So I believe the presentation of the recommendation in its original form is more supportable. All those in favor of the amendment only, that is the bolded struck through language. Councillor Coleman, Councillor Gardner, all those in opposition. Councillor Caradona, Dell, Hammond, myself, Kim, Loughton, and Thompson. So that is defeated. And so that amendment is not under consideration. And so we're back on the main motion unamended. Any other comments? Actually, Councillor Hammond, I have you next in the speakers list on the main motion. Do you have anything you'd like to add at this point? Okay. Anyone else in the main motion? Councillor Kim.
Can I move to postpone number 2 until after we have received the Victoria Civic Heritage Trust presentation?
Yes, you certainly may. So as I understand it, the motion is to postpone consideration of both parts of this motion until after the next item on our agenda, which we would address after a short break, and that is the presentation from the Civic Heritage Trust. Is there a seconder for that postponement? Councillor Coleman is seconding. That is not debatable. All those in favor? Councillor Coleman, this is on postponing until after we hear the presentation, the next presentation essentially from the Civic Heritage Trust. All those in favor? Councillor Coleman, Councillor Gardner, Councillor Hammond, Councillor Kim, Councillor Thompson. All those in opposition? Councillor Caradona, Councillor Dell, myself, and Councillor Loughton. So that postponement motion is adopted. And so we will postpone consideration